Morning world, Bill in for another episode. I want to jump right into it as today's topic is very difficult to discuss, but something that we have to discuss if we're going to be honest about our history. On the morning of March 16, 1968, American soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, entered a cluster of hamlets in Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. Over the next several hours, they killed between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. There was no battle. There was no enemy resistance. There were no Viet Cong fighters waiting in ambush. There was only a village full of people going about their morning routines and a company of American soldiers who had been told that this was enemy territory, that everyone in it was the enemy, and that they should destroy everything they found. This is the story of the My Lai massacre, the worst atrocity committed by American forces in the Vietnam War. It's also the story of how that atrocity was covered up for more than a year, how it was eventually exposed, and how the American military and the American public struggled to come to terms with what had happened. And it's the story of a handful of soldiers who tried to stop the killing, who risked their careers and even their lives to do the right thing, and who were vilified for years before finally being recognized as heroes. This is not an easy story to tell, but it's one that matters, because understanding what happened at My Lai helps us understand something important about war, about human nature, and about the responsibility we all share to speak out when we see injustice. So let's take a look back and try to understand what happened, why it happened, and what it means. To understand My Lai, you first have to understand what kind of war Vietnam was, and what kind of pressures the soldiers who fought it were under. Vietnam was unlike any war America had fought before. There were no front lines, no clear objectives to capture and hold, no way to measure progress by territory gained or lost. The enemy could be anywhere. A farmer working in a rice paddy might be a Viet Cong guerrilla at night. A village that seemed peaceful might be honeycombed with tunnels and weapons caches. A child might be carrying a grenade. The soldiers who fought in Vietnam learned very quickly that the old rules of warfare did not apply. They could not tell friend from enemy, combatant from civilian, safe ground from deadly ground. Every patrol might be an ambush. Every village might be a trap. Every step might trigger a booby trap or a mine that would tear off a leg or kill a man before he even knew he was in danger. This uncertainty took a terrible psychological toll. Soldiers who had been trained to fight a conventional enemy found themselves fighting shadows. They took casualties from an enemy they rarely saw, an enemy who struck without warning and vanished before they could respond. The frustration built with every casualty, every patrol that found nothing, every day spent walking through hostile terrain where death could come at any moment from any direction. The response from the American military was a strategy called search and destroy. The idea was simple: send units out into areas suspected of enemy activity, find the enemy, kill him, destroy his supplies, his infrastructure, his will to fight. Measure success not by territory held, but by body count, the number of enemy dead. It was a strategy that made a certain kind of sense on paper, but in practice, it created perverse incentives. When your performance is measured by how many enemy soldiers you kill, there is pressure to inflate the numbers, to count anyone killed as an enemy combatant, to blur the line between legitimate military targets and civilians who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The rules of engagement were supposed to protect civilians, but in a war where the enemy wore no uniform and hid among the population, those rules were often ignored or interpreted so broadly as to be meaningless. Quang Ngai Province, where My Lai was located, was one of the most heavily contested areas in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong had been operating there for years, and the population was considered sympathetic to the enemy. American units operating in Quang Ngai took heavy casualties from mines, booby traps, and ambushes. They rarely saw the enemy who was killing them, and they grew to hate the villages where the enemy found shelter and support. The frustration and anger were palpable. Some soldiers came to see the entire population as the enemy. Collaborators who fed and hid the Viet Cong, who planted the mines and booby traps, who smiled during the day and tried to kill you at night. This was not entirely wrong. The Viet Cong did rely on support from the local population, and many villages in Quang Ngai were indeed under Viet Cong control. But the conclusion that many soldiers drew, that everyone in the province was a legitimate target, was a terrible and tragic error. Charlie Company arrived in Vietnam in December 1967. They were part of Task Force Barker, a provisional unit assembled from elements of the 11th Brigade, 23rd Infantry Division, known as the Americol Division. The division had been hastily organized and deployed, and some historians have argued that it lacked the training, leadership, and unit cohesion of more established formations. Whether or not this contributed to what happened at My Lai is difficult to say, but it was certainly a factor in the environment that shaped Charlie Company's experience. The company was commanded by Captain Ernest Medina, a 31-year-old career officer who was respected by his men. He was known as a tough and capable leader, aggressive in combat, demanding of his troops. His platoon leaders were young lieutenants, most of them in their early 20s, still learning their trade. The first platoon was commanded by Second Lieutenant William Calley, a 24-year-old from Miami who had struggled in civilian life before joining the Army. Calley was not well regarded by his superiors or his peers. He was considered mediocre at best, a marginal officer who had trouble with land navigation and other basic military skills. But he was in command of 1st Platoon, and on March 16, 1968, his platoon would lead the assault on My Lai. In the weeks before the massacre, Charlie Company had been bloodied. They had taken casualties from mines and booby traps, losing men without ever seeing the enemy who was killing them. On February 25th, they were hit by a minefield that killed several soldiers and wounded many more. On March 14th, just 2 days before My Lai, a popular sergeant named George Cox was killed by a booby trap. The company held a memorial service for him on March 15th, the night before the operation. The men were angry, frustrated, and hungry for payback. The intelligence briefing for the operation told them that the 48th Local Force Battalion, a Viet Cong unit with an estimated strength of 250 to 280 fighters, was operating in the area around the village of Son My. The hamlets they were going to attack, known to the Americans as My Lai 4 and My Khe 4, were believed to be strongholds of the 48th Battalion. The soldiers were told to expect heavy resistance. They were told that the civilian population would be at the market by 7 a.m., so anyone remaining in the village after that time could be considered Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathizers. They were told to destroy the village, to kill the livestock, to burn the houses, to poison the wells. What exactly Captain Medina said in that briefing became a matter of intense dispute later. Some soldiers testified that he explicitly ordered them to kill everyone in the village, including women and children. Others said he was more ambiguous, that he talked about destroying the enemy and burning the village, but did not directly order the killing of civilians. Medina himself denied ever ordering the killing of non-combatants. Whatever the exact words, the message that many soldiers took away was clear. This was to be a day of reckoning, a chance to finally strike back at an enemy who had been killing them for months. On the morning of March 16, 1968, Charlie Company was inserted by helicopter into the area around My Lai. They expected to be met with heavy fire. Instead, they encountered no resistance at all. The 48th Local Force Battalion was not there. There were no Viet Cong fighters, no weapons, no military-age men. There were only the ordinary inhabitants of a Vietnamese farming village. Women cooking breakfast, children playing, old men sitting in doorways, farmers heading out to the fields. What happened next is almost impossible to comprehend. The soldiers of Charlie Company began systematically killing everyone they found. They shot people in their homes and in the streets. They threw grenades into bunkers where families were hiding. They gathered villagers into groups, lined them up in ditches and opened fire with automatic weapons. They killed babies and toddlers. They killed elderly women who posed no threat to anyone. They killed people who were trying to flee and people who were standing still with their hands raised. They killed for hours. The killing was not the work of a few soldiers who lost control. It was a systematic operation that involved dozens of men from multiple platoons. Lieutenant Calley's 1st platoon was the most heavily involved, but soldiers from 2nd and 3rd platoons participated as well. Some soldiers refused to participate, turning away or firing into the air rather than shooting civilians. Others joined in with what witnesses described as enthusiasm, hunting down fleeing villagers like animals, shooting them in the back as they ran. There were also sexual assaults. Soldiers raped women and girls before killing them. The exact number of victims is unknown, but multiple witnesses testified to seeing gang rapes and sexual violence throughout the village. The depravity was not universal, but it was widespread enough that no one who was there could claim ignorance of what was happening. The violence continued for hours. By the time it ended, the village of My Lai had been essentially erased. Houses were burned, livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned. The bodies of the dead lay everywhere, in the streets, in the ditches, in the burned-out ruins of their homes. The official body count reported to headquarters was 128 Viet Cong killed. The actual number of civilian dead was somewhere between 347 and 504, depending on which investigation you rely on. The victims ranged in age from infants to elderly. Most were women and children. While the killing was going on, something else was happening in the skies above My Lai. A helicopter crew from the 123rd Aviation Battalion was flying reconnaissance over the village, and they saw things that made no sense to them. They saw bodies everywhere. They saw soldiers shooting civilians. They saw a ditch filled with the corpses of women and children, and they decided to do something about it. The pilot of that helicopter was Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, a 25-year-old from Georgia who had already distinguished himself as a skilled and aggressive pilot. His door gunner was Specialist Lawrence Colburn, and his crew chief was Specialist Glenn Andriotta. They had been flying support for the operation, marking enemy positions with smoke grenades, and at first they assumed the bodies they saw were Viet Cong casualties from the fighting. But there was no fighting. There was no enemy fire. There was only the systematic slaughter of unarmed civilians. Thompson landed his helicopter near a ditch where he could see bodies piled on top of each other. He approached an officer, Captain Medina, and asked if the wounded civilians in the ditch could be helped. Medina said the only way to help them was to put them out of their misery. Thompson was stunned. He took off again and flew over the village, trying to understand what he was seeing. He spotted a group of civilians, including women and children, being herded toward a ditch by American soldiers. He knew what was about to happen. Thompson made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He landed his helicopter between the soldiers and the civilians, and he ordered his crew to open fire on the American soldiers if they tried to harm the villagers. He told Colburn to man his door gun and shoot any soldier who tried to hurt the civilians. Then he called in another helicopter to evacuate the villagers to safety. It was an almost unprecedented act. An American warrant officer was threatening to kill American soldiers to protect Vietnamese civilians. Thompson did not know if his orders would be obeyed, did not know if he himself would be shot, did not know what would happen when his superiors learned what he had done. But he knew that what he was seeing was wrong, and he could not stand by and let it continue. Glenn Andreotta went even further. He waded into a ditch filled with bodies and pulled out a small child who was still alive, clinging to his dead mother. Andreotta carried the child to the helicopter, and Thompson flew the boy to safety. It was a small act of mercy in the midst of unimaginable horror, but it was something. After the evacuations, Thompson flew back to base and immediately reported what he had seen to his superiors. He told them that American soldiers were murdering civilians. He was angry, visibly shaken, and he made it clear that he expected something to be done. His report went up the chain of command and set off what should have been a major investigation. Instead, it triggered a cover-up. The initial reports from the operation claimed a great victory. Task Force Barker reported 128 enemy killed and 3 weapons captured. The disparity between those numbers should have raised immediate questions, but it did not. General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, sent a congratulatory message. The operation was cited as a success in fighting the Viet Cong in Quang Ngai Province. Hugh Thompson's report was essentially ignored. A brief investigation was conducted, but it concluded that approximately 20 civilians had been inadvertently killed in the crossfire, a tragic but unavoidable consequence of combat operations. The investigation did not interview any Vietnamese survivors. It did not examine the physical evidence. It did not question the soldiers who had participated in the killing. It was a whitewash, designed to make the problem go away. And for more than a year, it worked. The massacre might never have been exposed if not for a young soldier named Ron Ridenour. Ridenour had served in Vietnam with the 11th Brigade, but was not present at My Lai. In the weeks and months after the massacre, he heard rumors about what had happened. Soldiers who had been there talked about it, sometimes boastfully, sometimes with evident distress. Ridenour listened and asked questions, and gradually he pieced together the story of what had happened on March 16, 1968. Ridenour was troubled by what he learned, but he did not know what to do about it. He returned to the United States in December 1968 and was discharged from the Army. For months he wrestled with his conscience, trying to decide whether to speak out. He knew that doing so would be controversial, that he would be accused of betraying his fellow soldiers, of giving ammunition to the anti-war movement, of undermining the war effort. But he also knew that what had happened at My Lai was wrong, and that covering it up was also wrong. In March 1969, exactly 1 year after the massacre, Ridenour wrote a letter and sent it to 30 members of Congress, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Army, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and several other officials. The letter described what he had learned about My Lai and called for a formal investigation. It was a remarkably brave act, a young veteran putting his reputation on the line to expose a crime that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. The letter could not be ignored. The Army was forced to open a real investigation, one that would eventually be conducted by the Criminal Investigation Division and would take more than a year to complete. The investigation confirmed the worst of what Ridenour had alleged, and more. It documented the systematic killing of hundreds of civilians, the destruction of the village, the sexual violence, and the subsequent cover-up. While the Army investigation was still underway, an investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh learned about the case from a tip. Hirsch tracked down William Calley, who was by then facing court-martial charges, and interviewed him. In November 1969, Hirsch published his story through the Dispatch News Service, a small wire service that he had to use because major newspapers were reluctant to touch the story. The impact was immediate and explosive. The American public learned for the first time that American soldiers had committed a massacre of unarmed civilians. The photographs, taken by Army photographer Ronald Haberle, were published in Life magazine and Cleveland Plain Dealer, showing the bodies of women and children lying in the dirt roads of My Lai. The images were shocking, impossible to dismiss or explain away. The reaction was deeply divided. Many Americans were horrified by what they saw and demanded accountability. Others defended the soldiers, arguing that they were just following orders, that they had been under tremendous pressure, that the Viet Cong used civilians as shields, and the villagers had been complicit in attacks on American forces. Some accused Ridenour and Hirsch of being traitors, of undermining the morale of American troops, of giving propaganda to the enemy. The court-martial of William Calley became a national spectacle. Calley was charged with the premeditated murder of 109 Vietnamese civilians. He was the only officer or enlisted man to be convicted of crimes at My Lai, though charges were brought against others. His defense was that he was following orders, that Captain Medina had instructed him to kill everyone in the village, and that he was simply doing what he had been told to do. The defense did not succeed in getting Calley acquitted, but it did resonate with a significant portion of the American public. Many people believed that it was wrong to punish a young lieutenant for carrying out orders from his superiors, that the real responsibility lay with the officers and officials who had created the conditions for the massacre and then covered it up. There was a widespread feeling that Calley was being made a scapegoat, that he was being punished for the sins of the entire system. On March 29, 1971, Calley was found guilty of murdering 22 Vietnamese civilians and sentenced to life in prison at hard labor. The verdict set off a firestorm of controversy. Within days, President Richard Nixon ordered Calley removed from the stockade and placed under house arrest at Fort Benning while his case was appealed. Politicians from both parties denounced the verdict. The governor of Georgia declared April 5th to be American Fighting Man's Day. Draft boards in several states resigned in protest. Popular songs were written defending Calley as a patriot who had been unfairly persecuted. The contrast between the public outpouring of support for Calley and the horror of what he had done is one of the most troubling aspects of the My Lai story. A man who had ordered his soldiers to shoot babies and had personally killed dozens of unarmed civilians became for many Americans a sympathetic figure, a victim of an unjust prosecution. The Vietnamese civilians who had died at his hands were forgotten, their lives deemed less important than the career of a young American officer. Captain Medina was also charged, but he was acquitted. No other officers were convicted. The senior commanders who had created the conditions for the massacre and then covered it up faced no legal consequences. The Army investigation documented serious failures at every level of command, from the platoon to the division. But the only punishment fell on the lowest-ranking officer involved. Calley's life sentence was reduced on appeal, first to 20 years, then to 10 years. He served less than 4 years, all of it under house arrest at Fort Benning. He was paroled in 1974 and returned to civilian life. He spent decades avoiding the press and refusing to discuss My Lai, finally offering a public apology in 2009, more than 40 years after the massacre. The men who tried to stop the killing and expose the truth faced a very different fate. Hugh Thompson was vilified when the story became public. He received death threats. He was shunned by other veterans. Congressman Mendel Rivers of South Carolina, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, tried to have Thompson court-martialed for his actions at My Lai. Thompson struggled with alcoholism and nightmares for years, haunted by what he had seen and by the reception he received when he tried to do the right thing. It took 30 years for Hugh Thompson and his crew to receive official recognition for their actions. In 1998, the Army finally awarded them the Soldier's Medal for heroism not involving conflict with an enemy. The citation praised them for their courage in protecting Vietnamese civilians and for their moral stand against the actions of their fellow soldiers. Thompson and Colburn returned to Vietnam and met with survivors of the massacre, an emotional reunion that brought some measure of closure to all involved. Glenn Andreotta, who had pulled the child from the ditch, never received his medal in person. He was killed in combat just 3 weeks after My Lai, when his helicopter was shot down. He was 20 years old. His soldier's medal was accepted by his family 30 years after his death. Ron Ridenour, the soldier who had exposed the massacre, faced similar criticism. He was accused of being a traitor, of stabbing his fellow soldiers in the back. But he never regretted what he had done. He went on to become an investigative journalist himself, continuing to expose wrongdoing and corruption until his death in 1998. In his final years, he reflected on why he had written that letter in 1969. He said it was simply a matter of right and wrong, that some things are so clearly evil that remaining silent is itself a form of complicity. The question of why My Lai happened has been debated for more than half a century. There is no single answer, no simple explanation that accounts for how ordinary young American men became mass murderers. The factors that contributed to the massacre were complex and interlocking, and understanding them requires looking honestly at things that are uncomfortable to examine. The soldiers of Charlie Company were not monsters. They were ordinary young men, drafted or enlisted from towns and cities across America. They had families who loved them, friends who remembered them fondly, lives they expected to return to when their service was over. Most of them had never done anything violent before they went to Vietnam, and most of them would never do anything violent again after they came home. They were shaped by their training, their experiences, and the culture of the unit they served in. The conditions in Vietnam pushed them toward violence in ways that are not hard to understand, even if they are hard to forgive. The constant fear, the frustration of fighting an invisible enemy, the losses they had suffered, the dehumanizing language used to describe the Vietnamese, the pressure to produce body counts, the leadership failures that allowed and even encouraged brutality. All of these factors contributed to creating an environment where atrocity became possible. But understanding is not excusing. The soldiers at My Lai made choices. They chose to pull the triggers, to throw the grenades, to line up civilians and shoot them. Some soldiers refused to participate, proving that resistance was possible. The excuse that they were just following orders is not adequate to explain or justify what they did. Following orders is not a defense when those orders are obviously illegal, and orders to murder unarmed women and children are obviously illegal. The Nuremberg trials after World War II established this principle clearly, and American soldiers were expected to know it. The cover-up that followed the massacre is in some ways even more disturbing than the massacre itself. It demonstrates that the problem was not confined to a single company or a single day. It extended up the chain of command, involving officers at every level who chose to protect the reputation of the Army rather than seek justice for the victims. The initial investigation was a farce, designed to produce a predetermined conclusion. The officers who conducted it did not want to find evidence of wrongdoing, and so they did not find it. They did not interview witnesses who might have told them the truth. They did not examine evidence that might have contradicted the official story. They wrote a report that attributed the deaths to combat operations and closed the case. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate decision to hide the truth, made by officers who knew or should have known what had happened. The cover-up continued for more than a year, until Ron Ridenour's letter made it impossible to ignore. Even then, the Army's response was reluctant and half-hearted. Charges were filed against more than 24 soldiers and officers, but almost all of them were dropped or resulted in acquittals. The message sent by the legal proceedings was clear. The Army was not serious about holding anyone accountable for My Lai. The only conviction was William Calley, and even he served less than 4 years for murdering 22 people. The contrast with how Vietnamese civilians who killed Americans were treated could not be more stark. The institutional failures that allowed My Lai to happen and then covered it up have been the subject of extensive study and reform. The Army rewrote its training programs to emphasize the laws of war and the obligation to refuse illegal orders. The rules of engagement were clarified. The command climate that had encouraged body count metrics over other measures of success was changed. In many ways, My Lai became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when military discipline breaks down and moral constraints are abandoned. But the lessons of My Lai were not learned once and for all. In every subsequent American conflict, there have been incidents of abuse and atrocity, from the torture at Abu Ghraib to the killings at Haditha. The pressures that contributed to My Lai, the fear, the frustration, the dehumanization of the enemy, the pressure to produce results, exist in every war. The challenge is to create systems and cultures that prevent those pressures from overwhelming the moral constraints that should govern the conduct of soldiers in combat. The legacy of My Lai is complicated. For the Vietnamese, it is a wound that has never fully healed. The survivors and descendants of the victims remember what happened, and many of them have never received any acknowledgement or compensation from the United States. The village has been rebuilt, and there is a memorial and museum at the site. But the dead cannot be brought back, and the trauma of that day echoes through generations. For Americans, My Lai is an uncomfortable reminder that we are capable of terrible things. The young men who committed the massacre were not fundamentally different from any other generation of American soldiers. They were placed in an impossible situation, given inadequate leadership, and subjected to pressures that broke down their moral restraints. What they did was evil, but it was a human evil, one that could happen again if we are not vigilant. The heroes of My Lai, the men who tried to stop the killing and expose the truth, offer a different lesson. Hugh Thompson, Lawrence Colburn, Glenn Andreotta, and Ron Ridenour showed that it is possible to resist, to do the right thing even when everyone around you is doing the wrong thing. They paid a price for their courage, faced ostracism and threats, but they maintained their integrity. Their example reminds us that individuals can make a difference, that the choices we make in moments of moral crisis define who we are. The story of My Lai is not a story with a happy ending. The dead are still dead. The perpetrators, for the most part, escaped justice. The country that sent those young men to Vietnam and created the conditions for the massacre has never fully reckoned with what happened. But the story is important nonetheless, because it tells us something true about war, about human nature, about the importance of moral courage and the consequences of its absence. War is not a clean or noble enterprise. It brings out the worst in people as well as the best. It creates conditions where ordinary human beings can commit extraordinary evil, and where the institutions that are supposed to prevent such evil can fail catastrophically. My Lai was not an aberration, an isolated incident that tells us nothing about the larger war. It was a product of that war, of its strategies and tactics, its pressures and incentives, its failures of leadership and judgment. Understanding My Lai means understanding something important about Vietnam and about war itself. The survivors of My Lai have spent decades seeking recognition and justice. Some of them met with Hugh Thompson when he returned to Vietnam in the 1990s, and they expressed gratitude for what he had tried to do. They did not blame all Americans for what happened. They understood that some Americans had tried to help them, had risked their lives to stop the killing. That distinction between those who committed atrocities and those who tried to prevent them is important. It reminds us that even in the worst circumstances, moral choice remains possible. Hugh Thompson died in 2006, Lawrence Colburn in 2016. They spent their later years speaking about My Lai, trying to ensure that the lessons of that day would not be forgotten. They visited military academies and officer training schools, telling their story to new generations of soldiers. They were humble about what they had done, insisting that they had simply done what anyone should do when confronted with obvious evil. But their humility only made their example more powerful. They showed that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite fear. Ron Ridenour died in 1998, but his legacy lives on in the tradition of whistleblowing and investigative journalism that he helped to establish. He proved that one person, armed with nothing but the truth and a willingness to speak it, can change history. His letters set in motion events that exposed one of the darkest chapters in American military history and forced a reckoning that, however incomplete, was better than the silence that would have otherwise prevailed. The Piers Commission, the Army investigation that finally documented what happened at My Lai, produced a 4-volume report that remains the most comprehensive account of the massacre and cover-up. It named names, documented failures, and made recommendations for reform. But its conclusions were largely ignored by the public, overshadowed by the drama of the Cali trial and the political controversies surrounding it. The report deserves to be better known, because it tells the full story in all its complexity and horror. My Lai matters because it happened, because it was covered up, because the cover-up was exposed, and because the exposure forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their war. It matters because the victims deserve to be remembered, not as abstractions or statistics, but as human beings whose lives were stolen from them on a March morning more than 50 years ago. And it matters because the moral questions it raises about obedience and resistance, about individual responsibility and institutional failure, about the nature of war and the obligations of citizenship, are questions that every generation must answer for itself. This has been another story from Great American Classics. Before we finish, it's worth taking a moment to remember the people who died at My Lai on March 16, 1968. They were not soldiers or combatants. They were farmers and mothers and children, ordinary people going about their lives in a village that had the misfortune to be located in a war zone. They were killed not because of anything they did, but because of what they represented to men who had been taught to see them as the enemy. Their names are recorded on a memorial in Vietnam, but most Americans have never heard them. We remember the soldiers, the politicians, the protesters, the journalists who shaped the story of Vietnam. We do not often remember the Vietnamese people who suffered most from the war, whose country was torn apart, whose families were destroyed, whose lives were shattered by forces beyond their control. My Lai should remind us of them. The dead of My Lai cannot speak for themselves, but their memory demands something of us. It demands that we remember what happened, that we understand why it happened, and that we commit ourselves to preventing such things from happening again. It demands that we honor those who tried to stop the killing and those who exposed the truth. And it demands that we be honest about our history, even when that honesty is painful, because only through honesty can we learn from our mistakes and become a better nation. The sacrifice of the innocent is not something we should ever forget, and their story still matters today. And I don't think this in any way takes away from the men and women that served our country faithfully, and we still have love and respect for them. Good day to you all.